When life happens, plans need to change. Shaping Change, hosted by certified financial planner Ross Marino, is dedicated to helping financial advisors better serve their clients when life takes those unexpected turns.
Welcome to the Shaping Change show. Today, I am joined by Dr. Kelly Crace. Hello, Kelly.
Hi, Ross. How are you? Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to spend a little time with you.
I am really excited to have you on this show, and I know I say that regularly, but I had a unique experience with you while I was preparing for the show. I went to look at some of your articles that were published online, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a second. And for the first time doing research, I literally never made it off one page. And you had sent additional links and check this and check that. And I thought, I'm never going to get there. I was on one page. It was so relevant to financial planners, to what I do on a regular basis. I thought we just have to stay on this and we have to talk on this. So before we dive into the show, can you tell everybody what you do?
That's very kind of you, Ross. Thank you very much. My name is Kelly Crace. I work out of a university setting. I'm at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Health and Wellness there, and also direct the Center for Mindfulness and Authentic Excellence, the CMAX Center. So that's just a long-winded title, but I'm a psychologist by training, and my life's work over the past 30 years has really been devoted to trying to understand what really predicts flourishing through life transitions. And can you actually train that? Can we actually train ourselves to move toward a deeper level of flourishing?
We're going to dive into flourishing. We've had a lot of disruption, and that's something that we're all familiar with. We've had the unexpected, unwanted, uncertain type of change that we're in the middle of. But before we dive into that, I want to go over an experience that I have regularly as a financial planner. All financial planners experience this, and I just had it again recently. Here's the experience. A client goes through a traumatic life event, and I don't want to dive into details, but scariest thing imaginable, right? The most traumatic things you can go through. We're on the phone. They're explaining what happened. Sometimes, Kelly, it's the same day, and we're sitting there thinking, this is so hard. We're saying, I'm so sorry. And then all of a sudden, like a switch flips and the person goes into task mode. And they want to know what we need to do. And I'm still reeling, and they're ready to get down to business. I mean, why is that?
So much of that, and that is such a common issue that we find, especially among, our financial consultants, and especially ones that really work deeply with transition and really work with clients during important periods of transition. But if you add that, it's really our mind protecting ourselves more than anything else. That's the bottom line. It's how we've been socialized, both in our overall society, our human brain through evolution. We get in protective mode because when you talk about, you said traumatic event, and what defines a traumatic event is when our system is overwhelmed. Our natural way of coping, our natural way of thinking has been overwhelmed. And in that place of overwhelm, we get very protective, that we move into this kind of survival mode. And for many people, we are socialized to, what do I do? What do I do next? How can I act next? And that's what takes us often to a very task-oriented mode. But it's also done in a time of being affected. We're afraid. We're afraid because we're overwhelmed. We get anxious about, am I going to be enough to be able to do this? But we're also, like you said, a traumatic event. We are deeply affected emotionally. We're grieving or we're in shock. If it's right in the moment, you're dealing with a client that's actually in shock at that point in time. And so they're looking for stability. And most of our clients that we work with come from a place of achievement, accomplishment, working hard expecting equity, that if I do something and work hard at it, that I'll get something from it. And so in that protective mode of wanting to try to get to a place of stability when feeling shocked, it's often, well, what can I do that's within my control that can bring me a sense of stability? And there's nothing wrong with that. We don't want to move people too far away from that too quickly. We don't want to take that away from them, but we want to add to it. We want it to be kind of a both and of, how do I work with them with where they're at? Give them something to do. And also, how do I get them to honor the fact that, paying attention to how you're feeling about this matters and giving this time matters. And how do we help you do that in a healthy way?
So you mentioned the goal of flourishing, and that's the title of the article that I got stuck on and couldn't get off the page. And I think you probably saw, I sent you an email with just quotes from the page and said, this is it. Here's the interview. I got it. These are questions I need to ask and things I need to know about. But you use the word flourishing, which is great. So you've done a lot of work on this. How about you define what flourishing is and share some of what you've learned?
Yeah, thank you. That is an overused term these days. We hear the term flourish quite a bit, and we hear it defined very differently. And we don't claim to be owners of the truth of how flourishing should be defined. But in our research, which started over 30 years ago, we have consistently operationalized that definition. We studied it with the following definition. We defined flourishing as a consistent level, not perfect level, but a consistent level of productivity with things that matter, fulfillment, and resilience. So that when we're flourishing, we find ourselves to be productive. We feel like we're doing good work in the things that matter to us. So we're finding ourselves with a purposeful productivity. It's productivity that's oriented toward purposeful activities. And we find meaning in it. We find fulfillment in it. So we're not just chasing our tail. There are times in our life where we find ourselves just busy and not even having the time to kind of reflect on what meaning does this have for me. But when we're flourishing, we do find that sense of fulfillment and meaning. And equally as important, we find ourselves to be resilient through the hardness and harshness and sometimes unfairness of the world around that work. That's equally important. And when we found when those three things are consistently there, that's when we move to this deeper level of flourishing. And one of the interesting things that we found through this is there were no natural born flourishers. we found that people that flourish work at it, and there's no secret island of super flourishers either. It takes work, and that's why we unashamedly talk about the work of flourishing, the work of wellness, because this takes time. It takes time to really understand and also to apply to our lives. But here's the good news. It's so attached to our own sense of wisdom, and it's so attached to an internal truth that when we apply the strategies that lead to flourishing, that predict flourishing, it gets internalized pretty quickly because you're really working with a truth that you already know to be there. It's just things are getting in the way of you holding on to that truth. We live in a relentless world of uncertainty, of change, of noise, of pace. And that pulls us away from flourishing. And so that's one of the other things that we found is our world doesn't foster flourishing. Our world drifts us from flourishing. And so we have to be very intentional and mindful on the pieces that predict flourishing in order to hold that. And interestingly, our brain doesn't even promote flourishing. Our brain, if we allow it to just naturally engage in things that matter to us, our brain will actually cause us to drift from flourishing unless we're more intentional about the things that predict it. And then the last thing we found is some of the things that we're taught that lead to flourishing in our research turned out to not actually do that. It actually turned to get in our way. And so it was just uncovering those things that we found fascinating and were really helpful for us to be able to develop this mental training, mental fitness program of how to flourish through difficult times, through unwanted change, or through difficult transitions as everybody faced over the past year and a half with the social justice issues and with the election stress that occurred over the past year.
Well, I know we have an instinct that when things get crazy around us and we feel overwhelmed, we want to slow things down. We want to calm things down. And
Yes.
you have an article, part of that article is the trap of chasing calm and happiness. And of course, I had to latch onto that because I'm thinking instinctively, well, don't I want calm, Kelly? Don't I want to be happy in the midst of all this turmoil? I'm thinking I really want to just be calm. Aren't there t-shirts that say stay calm and right, do whatever? But now
Yes.
Kelly says, well, there's actually a trap. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a real important paradox. It's what are you striving for? And so one of the traps that we hear all the time is the importance of being happy. that flourishing, and one of the things that we do know is people that flourish do experience more periods of happiness, and they do experience more periods of calm. So that became kind of a misunderstanding, a confusion that led us to start believing, well, okay, then that's what we should strive for. We need to strive for happiness. We need to strive for calm. But when we make that be the goal, it actually causes us paradoxically to become oversensitized to what we're feeling in the moment. So if I'm not happy, what do I need to rush to do to be happy? And if I am happy, how do I hold happy? It's this constant internalized checking on how am I feeling right now, which actually gets in the way of some of the principles that lead to flourishing. So what we found is people that more consistently flourish, instead of striving for happiness, they strive for meaning. Instead of striving for passion, they strive for purpose. And instead of striving for calm, they strive for health, healthy self-care. And that's so hard to do, especially after a difficult traumatic event or a difficult transition. Let's take example this past year and a half. Go back to 2019 New Year's Eve. And if you ask someone New Year's Eve 2019, what do you want 2020 to be like for you? There's no way anyone would have answered what ended up happening that they were going to have to prepare for. It was completely unpredictable. And so when we look at that, what can often happen is overworked and stressed, which was what 2019 and before was. Anybody that's engaged in this life finds themselves overworked and stressed. So that was our normal. That went from overworked and stressed to exhausted and strained. And when we become exhausted and when we move, we can manage stress. Stress is actually a good thing because stress is a function of caring. But when stress moves to strain, that's unsustainable. And so when we move into this place of high uncertainty, which sparks fear, triggers fear, all of this uncertainty around the pandemic and where things were going in our world, when heightened uncertainty and heightened fatigue, many people said, okay, I can manage this as long as everything's done by May. And then it got to May. It's like, okay, I can do this as long as everything's cleared up by August. It's when this thing started becoming open-ended that people started recognizing, I don't know if my natural coping resources can actually sustain. We were being asked to sprint an endurance event. And when you get into that phase, we become very fatigued, very anxious. And the most natural thing to do is to seek relief. So the most natural thing for people to do during difficult transitions or during a time like what we're facing now is to seek relief. And the natural way to do that is to seek to soothe or to seek calm. The problem is when we intend to do something just to feel better or just to seek relief, we tend not to moderate those things well. We tend not to manage those things well. And they become kind of unlimited. It moves from something that feels good in the moment to become a dependency that actually starts to add to the problem overall. So one, we come by it very honestly. It's a human thing. So it's not like we're doing anything wrong. It's just getting in the way of us flourishing. And so instead, we want to move from this kind of chasing happiness and chasing calm to one more of chasing purpose and chasing healthy self-care and chasing meaning.
If we're in this time of uncertainty, I think one of the challenges we have personally, and then also as financial planners trying to help and advise and help clients think through situations, is we really don't know what's going to be happening a year from now. And
Right.
I don't mean that from an investment standpoint,
Right.
which obviously we have no clue in that particular case, but just in life itself, this is a level of uncertainty we've never experienced before. And we obviously don't want to make decisions with long-term implications when we really just don't have enough information. So we try to put those decisions off. In the Financial Transition Institute, it's now soon later. Those things go in the later list. We don't have enough information, right? We can't make that decision. So we're going to put it in the later list. However, we still have to make decisions now. So how should I approach making decisions now when I know I may not have enough information, but I still have to have some mental process, some decision tree to say, okay, here's what I think I need to do, even though I have limited information?
Yeah, that can be a very scary time of feeling, especially if we kind of lean toward the perfectionistic or controlling end of managing stress by needing to have all the data and needing to feel in control of the factors around me. And when that's been impacted by either we are affected by something that has rocked us, or we're in a time of uncertainty, we won't have all the data. We're not omniscient. We're not omnipresent. We're not omnipotent, but we have to act. We have to do something now. And what we find is the best decisions we make are when we come back to decisions that are value-centered and purpose-driven. That is that's such a common thing that we hear. And yet, in our research that looks at flourishing, just because it's common and because you hear it a lot doesn't mean it's less true. It doesn't mean it's not accurate. It really does matter. But what we found is the difference we found with people that flourish is they move from values clarification to values relationship. In other words, they really take time to understand how their values are alive in their life. Rather than here's what my values are, it's how are my values alive in my life? And if the only way people could determine my values is from looking at my behavior, what would they see in my behavior that would tell them that this matters to me? And so one of the things that we focus on is we talk about the aspect is that all of us have three relationships in our life. We have a relationship with our values, we have a relationship with fear, and we have a relationship with comfort. All of us have a relationship with all three of those things. There are various times in our life that we're motivated toward comfort, and there are various times in our life when we're motivated toward fear. In fact, those are the two most natural human motivators, is fear and comfort. Whatever is the most urgent thing I'm motivated toward. And then after I take care of all the have-tos and the needs, then I seek comfort. That's the most natural human motivation. In fact, that's kind of what we call living at your neurology, because your brain is wired to kind of for crisis and regulation. So when you start living at your neurology, every day looks like have-tos and comfort, have-tos and comfort. Fully human, fully normal, but it doesn't lead to flourishing. And so what we found is what leads to flourishing is to lead with this relationship with your values and allow the relationship with fear and comfort to follow. Whenever we lead with fear or lead with comfort, even though it's natural, it gets in the way of flourishing and it gets in the way of our being our best selves. So what that means is basically starting every day with, instead of what do I have to do, or starting every day with what would make me feel better, it's starting every day with what matters to me today. And of that, what matters most? And what would that look like in action? And so what you're doing is you're intentionally moving your brain to a closer relationship with your values, because what we learned in our research is the most purest, deepest form of human motivation are your values, but only if you have a relationship with them. If you just say, here's my 5 values, I got my little badge and here are my 5 values that I wear, fear and comfort are going to override that every single time. But if I have this relationship with my values because I know what they look like, I know what it looks like in action, and I know what it looks like healthy, then I'm more than likely to step into that every day if I just intend it.
The values are powerful. And yes, it's common. And when you started talking about it, I thought, that's kind of cliche. And then you said, and this is common. I thought, because I remember 20 years ago, values-based selling. It made it through all industries. It was big in the financial planning industry. It's still talked about on a regular basis. You've done research over decades on values and how the significance of values influence our decision-making ability. And you told me that it didn't quite play out the way you thought initially. And as you explained it to me, that it was a little shocking to me how you explained it, but it does make sense. Can you talk about the relationship between how significant or important a value is to someone and how that influences their ability to make the best decisions?
Yes, and this is why having a relationship with your values, a healthy, close relationship with your values matters so much, because of what we learned in our research is prior to our research, the previous research to date had always, and I want to back up just a second, because values is also this very esoteric term. We often think of values in terms of ethics or morality or commonly held moral values. what we're talking about here are personal values, which are basic beliefs that guide your decision-making, guide your behavior, and guide your motivation. And so that's what we're talking about in that. And when we looked at that, we weren't looking at the relationship between values and ethics. We were looking at the relationship between values and flourishing. And we went on the assumed models that had always been shown before, which was this direct, linear, positive relationship between values and effectiveness, is that there was assumed this direct, positive, linear relationship, which means that the more I focus on my values, the more effective I'll be, which made sense because it made complete sense. Because if I focus on what matters to me, then I'll be motivated. And if I'm motivated, then I'll act. And that's why it leads to effectiveness. But our research showed that it's actually a curvilinear relationship. That yes, a focus and attention to our values has to be a part of our intentionality to have any shot at flourishing, but there's this point of diminishing returns. So it was this inverted U to where there were times when people were under-attending to their values and times when they were over-attending to their values. And that's what led to our understanding of the difference between preferences, values, and needs. So when we're under-attending to a value, we're calling a value, but we're actually acting on it like a want or a preference. And whenever we're acting on something as a preference, we're not fully psychologically committed to it. So I can sit there and say, I value fitness. I value being fit. And so, but if it's a preference, I won't fully engage consistently in what needs to be done to be fit. I will want it, and I'll say, I'm going to get up tomorrow at 4:00 and I'm going to run my 5 miles, that type of thing. But if it's at a preference, comfort's usually going to, at 4:00, comfort's usually going to win out, that type of thing. But I also, because I call it a value, I also don't let myself off the hook. So then I'll feel guilty at 10:00 in the morning for not having gone and run. So one, I don't get the benefit of being values driven because it's a preference. And secondly, though, I'll still feel guilty about it and shame myself for it. So that's when there's not a level of psychological commitment. And that's when you don't see that in a person's behavior. You'll hear them talk about what's important, but you don't see it in their behavior. And then there's the thing of overshooting your values. And that's when a value starts to become so tied to our self-worth and our identity that it actually drifts into a need state. So it's no longer I value achievement, it's I need to achieve. I don't value belonging, I need to belong. And whenever a value drifts into a need, it's psychologically out of perspective. Normal, it's human, but it's out of perspective. And the reason why that gets in the way of our effectiveness is it brings in a level of intensity that gets in our way. You know, we're in the middle of the Olympic era right now, and we're seeing all kinds of times where a person can move in athletics. They know about this notion of psychological press when they're pressing too hard. And when you move into this place of psychological press out of need, then we just get in our way. And that is usually centered around outcomes. When a value drifts into a need, we're also needing the world to cooperate. We need the world to give us the outcomes we've worked so hard from. In the past 2 Olympiads, we saw very clearly evidence where individuals underperformed than expected and times when people overperformed. And this was one of the biggest differences. We found that the individuals that had moved this experience to a need, that I need to get this medal to show that my sacrifice and all of those around me who sacrificed, it was worth it. It became a need. They underperformed. And the athletes that moved in and said, I value this experience. This matters to me. It's been a part of my life and it has meaning. And this is just an extension of it. This is just another opportunity for me to display my training and talent to date. They overperformed. And so it led us to start to distinguish between when you're talking about things that matter. If I were to really look at your behavior, and when you think of financial advisors working with their clients, what do you know about them? And you hear what they say, but with what they say that matters to them, is it being operated on as more of a want or a value or need? And what we learned is the sweet spot are values, is when a person truly says something matters to them and they are acting on it. That's what integrity is. And when we live with integrity, we move into this deeper state of effectiveness or flourishing.
As you explained the inverse U to me, it made me think of the inverse U related to stress, where if
Absolutely.
you're bored, you don't make real good decisions. You're overstressed, you don't make real good decisions. But somewhere in the middle,
Absolutely.
right, you're going to be a little more dialed in and you're going to make better decisions. And as you talked about being overemphasizing the value, I had two thoughts. The personal thought was the overprotective parent that is so
Yes.
fearful that something terrible may happen to their child that they overprotect, and that doesn't work out that well. And then in the financial world, as a financial planner, we come across some people that are terrified of debt. And they have this strong resistance that I can't carry any debt. And there's different drivers for that, but they may overemphasize paying off debt. And eventually they find out near retirement, they actually haven't saved enough. So instead of balancing, they overemphasize, they paid things down, but they still don't have enough money to retire. And we see that. And as you talked about that nonlinear relationship of not just the stress, but the fear and the value, that all of a sudden you're right, it's going to get in the way because they're only seeing this end game, this outcome, and they just don't make really good balanced decisions for that. So I think that really matters to financial planners. If I see that and I'm in the conversation, any tips on how I should approach it with a client?
It's helping them see that what's driving this, when they're moving into that state, where they're doing is they're leading with fear. And we spend time at the university level, and we do it with a lot of organizations, and especially multi-generational family organizations, of helping them to understand the difference between fear-based excellence and authentic excellence. Fear-based excellence is where our brain naturally goes. And interestingly enough, the more value-centered you are, the more vulnerable you are to fear-based excellence. And so what that basically means is whenever your brain leads with what matters to me, what's important to me, once I clarify this thing or person is important to me, there are three unavoidable truths that you can't escape. The first one is uncertainty. The truth is you never completely control everything that goes into something that matters to you. There's always a chance you could fail or lose that thing or person of importance. And if you did, there would be a cost. So that's the second truth that comes in, is there will be a cost. You would hurt in some way. The third truth that comes into play is today's time, whenever we're engaged in things that matter to us, we are aware that people are watching us and forming opinions about it. There's this perceived evaluation that we feel on display of people evaluating us when we're engaged in things that matter. So if you dare to care, you can't avoid those three things. And what that evokes in our brain is fear of failure. That's what gets activated. It's not danger fear. It's this notion in our brain when we're concurrently aware of this matters to me, and there's uncertainty about that. And that fear of failure creates psychological pressure. It's not a bad thing. It's just pressure. We feel that as pressure. But the interesting thing is if you allow your brain to naturally respond to that pressure, you'll go in one of two directions. You'll either try to over control and master, or you'll try to avoid and escape that pressure until it has to be done. We call this, and that's where perfectionism and procrastination play. That perfectionism and procrastination are the neurological, natural ways you cope with values-based fear. Because if I do it perfectly, I don't have to worry about failing. Or if I can sidestep this pressure until it has to be done, then when it has to be done, it doesn't matter if I'm afraid. Or if I wait long enough, maybe somebody will come in and take care of it for me. We found that this generation of young adults and their parents, these past two generational cohorts, have the highest incidence of fear of failure than any other previous generation because of something very wonderful and wise about them. This generation and the previous generation doesn't want to just be successful. They want to be successful in things that matter to them. But the competition for those meaningful things has never been more fierce. So importance is higher, but uncertainty is higher, and therefore fear is higher. So we've created these two generations together that manage fear the same way, through either perfectionistic over control or avoidance. That's where the helicopter parent came into play, where parents who wanted their children to succeed, and if they saw them drifting, they stepped in and took control. And so what do you think the reaction to the children were? Well, they just avoided, waiting for their parents to step in. It just created that kind of triangle of languishing. And the thing is, what we learned is about the fear-based model of excellence will work for you up to a point. It's motivational. It moves you kind of into this crisis mode. But what happens is it starts to have a ceiling effect and an increasing cost. We just over time start to see the negative impact of either perfectionism or procrastination, and it starts to get in the way. And the sad thing is when that model deteriorates in front of us, if I don't have another model to look at, then the only place I can go is back up to the top and care less, just care less in order to be calm. So instead of the pursuit of excellence, it becomes the pursuit of calm. Instead, what we try to move forward is when you are sitting with a client that's doing that, out of fear, they're over controlling, out of fear, they're avoiding. You keep trying to bring them into this conversation and they keep avoiding it left and right. It's about calling it for what it is. It's, this uncertainty is scary. This uncertainty around things that really matter to you is scary. And the natural way we cope with this is through either trying to control it or avoid it. But let's go back to the thing that started this in the first place. This matters to you. This thing you care about, it matters to you. It's important to you. So let's focus on that. What's one thing we could do toward this thing that matters to you? That is a step that we feel that we can take together, that feels healthy, and it feels like an action step that moves us, even if it's just one step further. And here's the great thing. Every time we step forward with our values while we're afraid, it neurologically changes how we process fear. So if I get afraid and I manage it through control and avoidance, that just keeps that fear motivation stoked. But if while afraid, I step back into the values, that I bring my value forward and I act on that value, that starts to change how we process fear. And that's what we as advisors can do in working with our clients, is compassionately helping them to understand the normality of controlling and avoiding, but to recognize that this is worry causing you to do this. Let's go back to what matters to you and take a step in that direction.
Excellent. Let's go to the final question. Here it is. It's the magic wand. If you could wave this magic wand, Kelly, change anything in the world, what would you do?
It's a great question. And I so badly want to cheat and just bring up 5 or 6 different things. But if I had to really boil it down into one, it would be about us changing our culture and gaining cultural traction and building norms around the importance of being values-led while emotional and thoughtful. I think culturally we can find ourselves in this place that we feel like we have to be steeled, that flourishing and resilience, that resilience is not being affected by something. That's not resilient. Resilience is while affected, how do I step into things that matter to me? And really what it has to be is, if I can be values-led while emotional, that I honor my emotions. I'm upset because something upsetting happened. I'm depressed because something depressing happened. That's not clinical depression. That's a normal human healthy reaction to something. And while I'm emotional, emotions are really a form of awareness that's telling us to pay attention and think more deeply. It's not telling us to run away and calm. It's telling us, hey, something's happening here that's impacting you. Let's think about it more deeply. Let's spend some time with it. And while all that's going on, I can still say, what matters to me right now and how can I step into that? So even while affected, even while we're just hanging on, if we can move from this thing of chasing happiness, chasing calm, to this thing of being very values-led while emotional and while thoughtful, I think that could really change and move us more intentionally into a state of flourishing. And I think I'm going to add one more bonus thing, if I could, one more last thing. One of the most neglected things that we do is we don't take time at the end of the day to take just a moment and appreciate and value where we've actually done that during the day. We actually found that people that flourish do that very intentionally at the end of the day. They take a moment and appreciate where they actually stepped into their values and led with their values. And what we found is people that languish don't take the time to do that. And yet we found even with people that languished, they were still acting on their values during their day. They just weren't giving it any credit. They were just skimming over it. And I think if we could just be more appreciative of where we are courageously stepping into our values every day, that would be a difference maker. I cheated. I'm sorry.
We'll take it. They were both excellent. And I'll just say they went well together. So we'll count them as one. How's that?
There we go. I love your reframe.
Thank you so much for being on the show, Kelly Crace.
Thanks, Ross. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to Shaping Change with Ross Marino. This show is for general information purposes only and is not intended to provide recommendations or advice. Speak with a legal, tax, or financial advisor before making any decisions. Past performance references are historical and do not guarantee future results. Visit rlsummit.com to learn more.